There is a specific kind of silence that only an empath can produce, not the silence of someone who has nothing left to say, but the silence of someone who has finally stopped saying everything, stopped explaining, stopped translating her own needs into language soft enough to be tolerated, stopped filling every gap with reassurance that was never hers to manufacture in the first place. This silence is not withdrawal in the way withdrawal is usually understood. It is not punishment, not a strategy, not a performance designed to provoke a particular reaction. It is simply what happens when an enormous, long-running labor of communication finally, quietly stops. This piece will address, honestly and without exaggeration, what sometimes happens on the other side of that silence, but its real subject is the silence itself, what it means, what it protects, and what it gives back to the person finally brave enough to hold it. What this silence actually is. For a long time, silence may have felt unbearable to you, something to fill immediately, something that signaled distance you needed to urgently close. An empath's instinct is often to bridge gaps, to translate confusion into clarity, to offer words when words are missing, to keep the emotional current flowing even when it's flowing entirely in one direction. This instinct comes from a genuine, generous place, but it has a cost, and the cost is this. As long as you keep filling the silence, the other person never has to sit inside it themselves. They never have to feel the absence your presence has been quietly preventing them from feeling. The silence this piece is describing is different from any silence that came before it. It's not confusion, and it's not simply running out of things to say. It's a deliberate, hard-won stopping, the moment you finally stop performing the labor of connection on behalf of two people instead of one. This silence doesn't require you to feel nothing. It simply means you've stopped translating what you feel into a form specifically designed to be palatable, easy, and low risk for someone else to receive. Understanding this distinction matters because the value of this silence was never really about what it produces in someone else. Its value is in what it protects in you, your own energy, your own peace, your own right to stop being the only source of emotional labor in a relationship that required two people to sustain it. Why this silence was so hard to reach. It's worth acknowledging honestly how difficult it actually is for an empath to reach this kind of silence, because it rarely comes naturally or easily. For a long time you may have believed, without fully realizing you believed it, that your silence would be read as abandonment, that stepping back from your usual role of explaining, reassuring, and bridging distance would cause harm you'd be responsible for. This belief kept you talking long after talking had stopped being useful, kept you present long after your presence had stopped being reciprocated with anything close to equal effort. Reaching genuine silence, the kind this piece is describing, required unlearning that belief slowly and with real difficulty. It required recognizing that your voice, your explanations, your reassurance were never actually obligations you owed indefinitely, regardless of whether they were being met with anything in return. It required tolerating the discomfort of not knowing what would happen once you stopped filling the space, a discomfort that for many empaths feels almost unbearable at first, precisely because it runs so directly against the instinct that has shaped so much of how you've related to other people. This silence, once reached, represents real growth, not because of anything it might provoke externally, but because of what it required internally. A fundamental shift in your belief about your own responsibility for someone else's emotional experience, a shift that took real courage and real difficulty to make. General patterns worth understanding, held loosely. It's useful in a general sense to understand some patterns that sometimes emerge when someone accustomed to a partner's constant emotional labor suddenly experiences the absence of it. Patterns drawn from broader relational psychology rather than confident predictions about any one specific person. These patterns exist on a spectrum, and it's worth holding them loosely rather than assuming any particular one will definitely apply to your own situation. Sometimes the sudden absence of a partner's usual reassurance and pursuit produces a kind of disorientation, an unfamiliar quiet that had previously always been filled, prompting a person to notice, perhaps for the first time in a long while, exactly how much labor was being done on their behalf without their full awareness of it. This disorientation can sometimes prompt genuine reflection, sometimes prompt renewed effort to reconnect, and sometimes prompt further withdrawal, a retreat into distance that feels safer than confronting the discomfort silence has suddenly introduced. There is no way to predict with any real confidence which of these responses will show up in a given case, and it's worth resisting the urge to treat any single outcome as guaranteed. What matters far more than predicting the specific response is understanding what your own silence is actually doing, independent of how it lands on the other side. It is returning your own labor to you. It is ending a pattern where your voice did the work of two people's communication. Whatever happens externally, this internal shift is real, complete, and entirely within your own control, regardless of how anyone else responds to it. Why crumbling isn't really the point. It's worth naming honestly that the framing of someone else crumbling, however satisfying it might feel to imagine, isn't actually the most useful way to think about what your silence accomplishes, because it keeps your attention oriented toward an external outcome you can't control or verify, rather than toward the internal shift that's actually within your power to sustain. Whether or not someone else experiences distress, disorientation, or genuine reckoning in response to your silence is simply not something you can know for certain, and building your own sense of peace or vindication around that uncertain outcome sets you up for continued dependence on their reaction, the exact dependence this silence was meant to help you release. The more accurate, more useful framing is this: your silence isn't a weapon aimed at producing a particular reaction in someone else. It's a boundary protecting your own energy, your own peace, and your own right to stop being the primary engine of a relationship's emotional labor. Whether or not this boundary produces visible distress on the other side is, in a real sense, beside the point. The boundary matters because of what it protects in you, not because of what it might or might not provoke in someone else. Letting go of the need for visible confirmation that your silence has landed the way you might hope frees you from continuing to monitor for that confirmation, which would otherwise keep you tethered to exactly the dynamic this silence was meant to help you step back from in the first place. What silence does for your own nervous system. Beyond anything it might or might not produce externally, this silence has a direct, measurable effect on your own internal state, one worth paying close attention to as this process unfolds. Constantly monitoring, explaining, and managing another person's emotional experience requires ongoing activation, a background hum of vigilance that most empaths carry so consistently they stop noticing it as unusual. When you finally stop this labor, even before anything changes on the other side, your own nervous system often begins to settle, gradually, in ways that are physically noticeable if you pay attention to them. You might notice in the days and weeks following this silence that your sleep deepens, that your body carries less tension, that your mind has more room for thoughts unrelated to managing someone else's reactions. This isn't incidental. It's direct evidence of the actual cost this labor was extracting from you, a cost that becomes visible precisely at the moment you stop paying it. Pay attention to these physical signals as this process unfolds, because they offer some of the most reliable evidence available that your silence is serving its real purpose, protecting and restoring you, regardless of anything happening externally. This settling doesn't happen instantly, and it's worth being patient with the process, understanding that a nervous system accustomed to constant vigilance takes real time to learn that the vigilance is no longer required. But it does happen gradually, and it's one of the most valuable, most concrete outcomes available from the silence this piece has been describing throughout. Breaking the cycle of pursuit and withdrawal. It's worth naming directly the specific dynamic this silence often interrupts, a cycle common in relationships where one partner tends toward withdrawal and the other tends toward pursuit, a pattern well documented in relational psychology broadly. In this cycle, one partner's withdrawal triggers increased pursuit from the other, seeking reassurance, seeking closeness, seeking some resolution to the discomfort withdrawal produces. This pursuit, in turn, often triggers further withdrawal, as the pursuing partner's increased effort can feel, to someone already struggling with closeness, like additional pressure rather than reassurance. The cycle continues, each person's response reinforcing the other's pattern, without either person necessarily intending for this to happen. An empath's silence, the kind described throughout this piece, often interrupts this cycle directly, not through any deliberate strategy but simply because the pursuit stops. Whether this interruption changes anything on the other side of the dynamic isn't something you can control or predict, but it does change something significant on your side. You're no longer participating in a pattern that was, by its very structure, unlikely to ever fully resolve as long as both halves of the cycle kept reinforcing each other. Understanding this dynamic helps explain why silence, however uncomfortable it feels to hold, is often more genuinely productive than continued pursuit, not because it guarantees any particular external outcome, but because it removes your own participation from a cycle that was never going to resolve through more of the same pattern that had already been repeating for a long time. The difference between silence as punishment and silence as boundary. It's worth drawing a clear distinction between two things that can look similar from the outside but come from very different internal places. Silence used as punishment, a deliberate strategy meant to provoke guilt or distress in someone else, and silence held as a boundary, a simple, honest reflection of your own decision to sin. Performing labor that wasn't being reciprocated. This distinction matters both for your own integrity and for your own peace, because silence held as punishment tends to require ongoing monitoring of its effect, a need to confirm it's working, that ultimately keeps you just as tethered to the other person's reaction as constant engagement would. Silence held as a boundary doesn't require this monitoring. It's not contingent on producing a specific effect in order to be valid or worthwhile. It's valid simply because it reflects your own honest decision about what you're willing to continue offering, independent of how that decision lands on the other side. This kind of silence tends to feel different from the inside, calmer, more settled, less charged with anticipation about what it might provoke, because its value was never actually located in what it provokes at all. If you notice yourself monitoring closely for signs that your silence is having a particular effect, it's worth gently examining whether the silence has drifted from boundary into something closer to strategy, and redirecting your attention back toward the internal, boundary-based reasoning that makes this silence genuinely sustainable and genuinely yours, regardless of anything it does or doesn't produce externally. What silence teaches you about yourself. Beyond anything it reveals or doesn't reveal about someone else, this silence teaches you something significant and lasting about your own capacity, specifically your capacity to tolerate discomfort without immediately acting to resolve it. For a long time, the discomfort of an unresolved gap, an unanswered question, an unclear emotional state may have felt intolerable, something you needed to fix immediately through your own words, your own reassurance, your own effort. Holding silence genuinely and consistently teaches you that you can tolerate this discomfort, that it doesn't require your immediate intervention in order to be survivable. This lesson extends far beyond this specific relationship. It becomes a permanent capacity, informing how you handle uncertainty and discomfort in every future situation, romantic or otherwise, where the old instinct to fill every gap with your own labor might otherwise reassert itself. Learning that you can sit with discomfort, that you don't have to resolve every uncertain moment through your own effort, is one of the more valuable, transferable skills available from this entire experience, worth recognizing and honoring directly as a genuine outcome of everything you're practicing right now. This growing capacity for tolerating discomfort without immediate action is, in many ways, more valuable than anything that might or might not happen externally as a result of your silence. It belongs entirely to you, permanently, regardless of anything else that unfolds. Trusting silence over engagement. There will likely be moments during this process when the old instinct to re-engage, to explain, to reach out and fill the silence with reassurance, feels strong, especially during moments of doubt or loneliness when the discomfort of silence feels harder to tolerate than usual. During these moments, it's worth pausing to ask yourself honestly whether re-engaging would actually serve your own well-being, or whether it would simply be a return to the old pattern of labor that this silence was specifically meant to help you release. This isn't about rigidly refusing all future engagement forever, as though silence itself has become a new, permanent rule you're not allowed to break under any circumstances. It's about making any future engagement a deliberate, considered choice, rather than a reflexive return to old patterns triggered by discomfort alone. If you do eventually choose to re-engage, let that choice come from a place of genuine readiness and genuine reciprocity, rather than from the old anxious urge to fill silence simply because silence feels uncomfortable to sit inside. Trusting silence over reflexive engagement means trusting that discomfort, on its own, isn't sufficient reason to abandon a boundary you've built for good, well-considered reasons. This trust develops with practice, becoming easier the more you demonstrate to yourself that you can, in fact, tolerate the discomfort without needing to immediately resolve it through a return to old patterns. Sitting with the discomfort of silence. It's worth being honest that holding silence, especially in its earlier stages, often feels genuinely uncomfortable, sometimes intensely so, and that this discomfort deserves acknowledgement rather than being minimized in favor of a purely triumphant narrative about strength and boundaries alone. You might feel loneliness, uncertainty, even moments of doubt about whether this silence is the right choice, moments where old patterns of anxious monitoring try to reassert themselves despite your best efforts to release them. This discomfort is a normal, expected part of this process, not a sign that something has gone wrong or that your silence isn't genuinely serving you. Sitting with this discomfort, rather than immediately trying to resolve it, is itself part of the growth this piece has been describing throughout. It's worth developing specific healthy practices for managing this discomfort as it arises, whether through movement, through connection with supportive people, through journaling, or through whatever specific practices help you feel more grounded and present during moments when the discomfort of silence feels particularly acute. Give yourself real compassion during these uncomfortable moments, understanding that the discomfort itself doesn't invalidate the value of what you're building through this silence. It's simply part of the process, temporary and survivable, gradually becoming easier to tolerate the more you practice holding it consistently over time. What fills the space once you stop chasing? One of the more valuable outcomes available from this silence is discovering exactly what naturally fills the space that used to be occupied by constant explaining, reassuring, and managing someone else's emotional experience. For many empaths, this space, once vacated, initially feels strange, almost uncomfortably empty, simply because it had been so consistently occupied for so long that its absence takes some adjustment to fully register as available rather than as a problem requiring resolution. Over time, this space tends to fill with things that actually belong to you, interests you'd set aside, relationships you hadn't had the bandwidth to fully invest in, a quality of presence with yourself that chronic outward-focused labor had been quietly crowding out. Notice deliberately what actually moves into this space as your silence continues, because this noticing offers concrete, tangible evidence of what your silence is actually protecting and restoring, beyond any abstract discussion of its value. This filling process happens gradually, not all at once, and it's worth being patient with it, allowing the space to fill naturally, rather than immediately trying to occupy it with something new before you've had the chance to simply notice what's actually available to you now, that it's no longer being consumed by labor that was never fully yours to perform in the first place. Silence as an act of self-respect. It's worth naming directly what this silence actually represents at its core. An act of self-respect, a decision that your own energy, your own peace, and your own emotional labor are valuable enough to protect rather than to keep extending indefinitely without reciprocity. This reframe matters because it shifts the meaning of this silence away from anything related to punishing or provoking someone else and firmly back toward what it actually is. A boundary built on your own worth, held because you've decided that worth deserves protection. Every day you continue holding this silence, you reinforce this act of self-respect, building it into something more solid and more automatic with each repetition. This isn't a single decision made once and then finished. It's an ongoing practice, and understanding it as self-respect rather than as strategy or punishment helps sustain that practice more reliably, because self-respect, unlike strategy, doesn't require external confirmation of its effectiveness in order to remain worthwhile. Hold this framing close throughout this entire process. Your silence is valuable because of what it protects in you, not because of what it might or might not produce in someone else, and returning to this understanding whenever doubt arises helps keep this practice sustainable, genuine, and fully your own. Building capacity for stillness. Beyond the specific context of this relationship, this silence is teaching you a broader capacity for stillness, the ability to remain settled and present without needing to constantly generate action, explanation, or reassurance in order to feel secure. This capacity for stillness is valuable far beyond romantic relationships, informing how you handle uncertainty in friendships, at work, in any situation where the old instinct to fill every gap with effort might otherwise reassert itself. Building this capacity takes practice, the same way any skill takes practice, and it's worth recognizing every moment you successfully hold stillness, even briefly, as genuine progress toward this broader, more transferable capacity. Over time, stillness becomes less effortful, less something you have to actively maintain against a strong pull toward old patterns, and more something that simply becomes part of how you naturally move through uncertainty and discomfort going forward. This capacity for stillness, once built, becomes one of the more valuable, lasting outcomes of everything you're practicing right now, worth recognizing as a genuine achievement independent of anything else happening in this specific relationship. What happens to old patterns of monitoring? For a long time, you may have monitored closely, consciously or not, for signs of someone else's emotional state, their mood, their level of engagement, their potential withdrawal, treating this monitoring as a necessary form of vigilance required to maintain the relationship. As your silence continues and deepens, this old pattern of monitoring often begins to fade, not because you've decided to stop caring in some general sense, but because the specific labor of tracking and managing someone else's internal state has simply stopped being something you're actively performing. Notice this fading as it happens, because it offers concrete evidence of how thoroughly your own attention is returning to yourself, rather than remaining oriented outward toward someone else's emotional experience. This fading doesn't happen instantly, and old habits of monitoring may resurface periodically, especially during moments of stress or uncertainty, but the overall trend with continued practice tends to be a gradual reduction in how much of your attention remains automatically oriented toward tracking someone else's internal state. This reduction in monitoring is one of the clearest, most practical markers of the growth this silence is producing, freeing up real cognitive and emotional bandwidth that had previously been consumed by a form of vigilance that was never actually sustainable or healthy to maintain indefinitely. The peace of not needing a reaction. There is a specific, significant peace available once you stop needing any particular reaction from someone else in order to feel settled in your own decision to hold this silence. This peace doesn't depend on whether the other person experiences distress, reflection, renewed effort, or nothing at all in response to your silence. It depends entirely on your own internal clarity about why you've made this choice, clarity that remains stable regardless of any external response. Reaching this peace requires releasing a specific kind of attachment to outcome, the belief that your silence needs to produce a particular result in order to be validated as the right decision. This release is genuinely difficult, especially if part of what initially motivated the silence was some hope, conscious or not, that it might finally provoke the kind of recognition or change you'd long hoped for. Letting go of this hope, or at least holding it loosely rather than needing it fulfilled, is part of what makes this peace genuinely available and genuinely sustainable. Practice returning to this peace whenever the pull toward needing a specific reaction arises, gently redirecting your attention back to the internal clarity that makes this silence valuable regardless of anything it does or doesn't produce externally. What this silence means for future relationships. Everything you're building through this practice of silence, this capacity for stillness, this trust in your own boundaries, this release from needing external confirmation, carries forward into every future relationship you build going forward. You'll bring a stronger, more automatic instinct for recognizing when you're performing disproportionate emotional labor, and a greater willingness to step back from that labor earlier, before it reaches the point of exhaustion that characterized this particular relationship. You'll also bring a deeper trust in your own capacity to hold boundaries even amid discomfort, a trust built through direct, difficult practice rather than through theory alone. This trust protects you from repeating patterns of chronic overfunctioning in future relationships, informing a healthier, more balanced approach to emotional labor from the very beginning of any future connection you build. This is one of the most valuable, lasting outcomes available from everything described throughout this piece, wisdom and capacity that will serve you well beyond this specific relationship and into every future connection where the old instinct toward constant, one-sided emotional labor might otherwise try to reassert itself. The empath's relationship with her own voice. It's worth reflecting directly on how this silence changes your relationship with your own voice, not permanently silencing it, but recalibrating when and how it gets used going forward. For a long time, your voice may have been almost constantly available, ready to explain, reassure, and translate on someone else's behalf, regardless of whether that labor was being met with anything close to equal effort. This silence teaches your voice a new discipline, reserving itself for situations where it will actually be received and reciprocated, rather than offering itself indiscriminately regardless of whether it's genuinely welcomed or valued. This recalibration doesn't mean becoming permanently quieter or less expressive in a general sense. It means becoming more intentional, more protective of when and how your voice gets extended, ensuring that its considerable value gets directed toward relationships and situations capable of actually receiving and honoring it. This is a healthier, more sustainable relationship with your own voice than the one that may have characterized your role in this particular relationship, and it's worth recognizing and honoring this shift as genuine growth rather than as any kind of diminishment. Your voice remains as valuable and as capable as it always was. What's changed is your willingness to extend it indiscriminately, and that change protects both your voice and your energy for relationships genuinely capable of receiving them well. When old doubt tries to undo this silence, there will likely be moments, even well into this process, when old doubt resurfaces, questioning whether this silence is genuinely the right choice, whether you're being too harsh, too withholding, too unlike the generous, communicative person you've always understood yourself to be. This doubt deserves examination rather than automatic obedience, because it often reflects old beliefs about your own worth being contingent on constant availability and constant emotional labor, beliefs this entire process has been working to help you release. When this doubt arises, it can help to return to your own clear, considered reasoning for this silence, reminding yourself of the accumulated pattern that made it necessary, the labor imbalance it's protecting you from, the genuine growth it's producing in your own capacity for boundaries and self-respect. Having this reasoning articulated clearly, perhaps even written down, offers a stable reference point to return to whenever this old doubt tries to pull you back toward patterns you've already recognized as unsustainable. Trust that this doubt, however persistent it sometimes feels, doesn't actually reflect the truth about whether your silence is the right choice. It reflects old, deeply ingrained beliefs about your own worth being tied to constant, indiscriminate availability, beliefs worth examining and gently releasing as this process continues to unfold. What genuine reciprocity would actually look like. It's worth spending time imagining, clearly and specifically, what genuine reciprocity would actually look like in a relationship, so that you have a concrete standard to measure any future engagement against, rather than being persuaded by vague gestures that don't actually rise to the level of the reciprocity you deserve. Genuine reciprocity looks like someone initiating communication as often as you do, rather than leaving that initiation almost entirely to you. It looks like someone extending emotional labor of their own, rather than simply receiving yours without offering anything comparable in return. It looks like consistency sustained over time, not a single dramatic gesture offered in response to the discomfort of losing access to something familiar. Having this concrete standard articulated clearly protects you from being persuaded prematurely by anything less than genuine reciprocity, should any future engagement eventually arise. It also offers a useful benchmark for evaluating future relationships more broadly, ensuring that whatever connection you build next, whether with this same person or with someone entirely new, is measured against an accurate, well-considered standard rather than against the diminished expectations that chronic overfunctioning in this relationship may have gradually normalized. This clarity about genuine reciprocity is one of the most valuable practical outcomes available from everything this piece has described, protecting your future investment of emotional labor and ensuring it goes only toward relationships genuinely capable of matching it. The body's experience of holding silence. It's worth attending directly to the physical experience of holding silence over time, because the body often processes this significant shift alongside, and sometimes ahead of, the mind's conscious understanding of what's happening. In the earlier stages, holding silence might produce real physical tension, an urge to reach for your phone, a restlessness that reflects the discomfort of breaking a long-standing habit of constant engagement. Over time, with continued practice, this physical tension tends to ease, replaced gradually by a calmer, more settled physical baseline that reflects your nervous system's growing recognition that the constant vigilance it once maintained is no longer required. Paying attention to these physical signals offers valuable, concrete information about your own progress through this process, sometimes more reliable than your conscious thoughts alone, especially during periods when doubt or discomfort make cognitive clarity harder to access consistently. If your body is settling, sleeping more deeply, carrying less tension, that's meaningful evidence that your silence is serving its intended purpose, regardless of anything happening externally. Give your body the time and patience it needs to fully adjust to this significant shift, understanding that physical settling, like every other aspect of this process, tends to happen gradually rather than all at once, deepening with continued, consistent practice over time. Why this silence doesn't require an announcement. It's worth addressing directly a question that sometimes arises during this process, whether you need to formally announce or explain this silence before holding it, providing some kind of advance notice about your intention to step back from your previous role of constant explanation and reassurance. Generally, you don't. Silence as a boundary doesn't require advance notice or extensive justification in order to be legitimate. You are allowed to simply stop performing labor that wasn't being reciprocated, without first providing a detailed announcement of your intentions or a formal opportunity for the other person to respond before you're permitted to actually hold the silence itself. This isn't about withholding fairness or acting without transparency. It's simply a recognition that boundaries don't require formal announcement to be valid, and that requiring yourself to provide extensive advance notice before holding a boundary you've already, through real accumulated experience, determined is necessary, only delays your own protection without offering any genuine benefit in return. If you choose to communicate your reasoning at some point, that remains a legitimate choice, but it's a choice, not an obligation, and you're equally entitled to simply hold this silence without extensive explanation if that feels like the healthier, more sustainable path for you specifically. The confidence that builds with each day of holding this silence. There's a specific, gradually building confidence available to you as you continue holding this silence consistently over time. A confidence built not on any single dramatic moment, but on the accumulated evidence of your own consistency, your own capacity to honor a boundary you've set even amid discomfort or uncertainty. Each day you continue holding this silence, you reinforce this confidence a little further, building evidence that you are, in fact, capable of the self-respect and self-protection this entire process requires. This confidence doesn't depend on anything happening externally. It's built entirely out of your own consistent practice, your own repeated choice to honor your own needs over the old pull toward reflexive engagement. Notice this confidence as it builds, recognizing it as genuine, hard-won evidence of your own growth, rather than dismissing it as insignificant simply because it develops gradually rather than through a single decisive moment. This growing confidence becomes one of the most valuable, lasting outcomes available from everything you're practicing right now, a permanent resource you carry forward into every future situation that similarly tests your capacity for boundaries and self-respect. What to do if renewed contact arrives? If renewed contact does eventually arrive during or after this period of silence, it's worth having a considered, practical approach ready in advance, rather than needing to construct one reactively in the moment, when clear thinking might be harder to access. This might mean giving yourself deliberate space before responding, rather than replying immediately out of old habit or anxiety. It might mean evaluating any renewed contact against the standard for genuine reciprocity this piece has already described, rather than being persuaded by a single gesture that hasn't yet had the chance to demonstrate sustained consistency. It's worth remembering, too, that you're not obligated to respond simply because contact arrives. Your silence remains a valid, legitimate choice regardless of whether it's met with renewed effort from the other side, and you're entitled to continue holding it for as long as you determine is genuinely necessary for your own well-being, regardless of any external pressure, real or perceived, to respond quickly or at all. Whatever you eventually decide, trust that your own careful, considered judgment deserves more weight than any urgency, external or internal, to respond immediately. This is your process, unfolding at your own pace, and any renewed contact doesn't automatically obligate you to change that pace unless you genuinely choose to. The empath's right to an unexplained boundary. It's worth stating plainly and directly something that can be difficult for many empaths to fully internalize. You have a right to hold a boundary, including this silence, without providing an exhaustive, persuasive explanation for why. Your own experience of exhaustion, imbalance, and depletion is sufficient justification on its own, and it doesn't require external validation, agreement, or understanding from anyone else, including the person this silence is directed toward, in order to be legitimate and worth honoring. This right matters because so much of what may have kept you in a pattern of constant explanation and reassurance was an underlying belief that your needs only counted if you could sufficiently justify them to someone else's satisfaction. Releasing this belief means recognizing that your own experience is enough on its own to warrant the boundary you've set, regardless of whether that boundary is ever fully understood or agreed with by anyone else. Claim this right fully and without apology. It is yours, earned through everything you've navigated to reach this point, and it doesn't require anyone else's permission or understanding in order to remain valid. A reflection on what real strength looks like here. It's worth offering a clear reflection on what strength actually looks like in the specific context of holding this silence, because it's easy to imagine strength as something loud, dramatic, or performative, when in practice, the strength this piece has been describing throughout looks quite different. It looks like the quiet, undramatic consistency of simply not reaching out day after day, even when reaching out would feel easier in the moment. It looks like tolerating discomfort without immediately acting to resolve it. It looks like trusting your own judgment even when no one else can confirm it for you. This quieter form of strength is in many ways more difficult and more valuable than any single dramatic confrontation, because it requires sustained, ongoing practice rather than a single decisive moment of resolve. Recognize this quieter strength as genuinely significant, deserving of the same respect and acknowledgement you might more readily extend to more visibly dramatic forms of courage. You are demonstrating this quieter, more sustained strength right now. Through every day you continue holding this silence, and it deserves to be recognized and honored as exactly what it is: real, significant, and entirely your own. What support actually looks like during this period. It's worth naming directly what kind of support tends to be most helpful while you're navigating this specific period of holding silence, because well-meaning people around you may not always know exactly what kind of help would actually serve you best. What tends to help most isn't speculation about what the other person might be thinking or feeling in response to your silence. Speculation that, however well-intentioned, tends to pull your attention right back toward the external monitoring this silence is meant to help you release. What tends to help most is steady, practical presence, people who reinforce your own clarity rather than introducing new doubt, people who can simply sit with you without needing to solve or predict anything about the situation. If the people around you tend toward speculation rather than steady presence, it's worth naming directly what kind of support would actually be most helpful, letting them know that what you need most right now is simply company and reinforcement of your own clarity, rather than analysis of what might be happening on the other side of your silence. Most people, once they understand what's actually needed, are glad to adjust the kind of support they're offering. Lean on this kind of steady support deliberately throughout this process, understanding that navigating this significant shift alone, without any outside reinforcement, is considerably harder than navigating it with genuine, well-calibrated support around you. The practice of returning to your own reasoning. Whenever doubt, discomfort, or the old pull toward reflexive engagement arises during this process, it can help enormously to have your own clear reasoning readily available to return to, ideally written down in your own words during a moment when your thinking felt relatively settled and clear. This written reasoning becomes a stable anchor, something to reread whenever you're in the moment emotional state makes accessing that same clarity more difficult than usual. This reasoning doesn't need to be elaborate. It simply needs to capture honestly why this silence matters to you, what pattern it's protecting you from, what growth it represents, and what you need going forward regardless of anything happening externally. Having this record available offers real, practical support during the more difficult stretches of this process, a reliable reference point built from your own clearest thinking, ready to support you whenever that same clarity becomes harder to access in the moment. This is a small, practical tool, but its value tends to prove significant, especially during the specific moments when old doubt or old hope threaten to destabilize the clarity you've worked so hard to build throughout this entire process. What this silence reveals about your own growth. Beyond anything it does or doesn't reveal about the other person's response, this silence reveals something significant and genuinely worth honoring about your own growth. The simple fact that you're capable of holding this boundary at all, that you've moved from a pattern of chronic, indiscriminate emotional labor to a place of genuine self-protection and self-respect, reflects real, substantial growth, independent of anything else happening in this specific relationship. This growth deserves to be recognized directly, not overshadowed entirely by curiosity or anxiety about what's happening externally. You have grown, measurably and significantly, simply by reaching the point of being able to hold this silence consistently, and that growth belongs to you permanently, regardless of anything else that happens as a result of it. Take a moment to actually recognize this growth clearly, rather than moving too quickly past it toward whatever comes next. You are, in a real and measurable sense, a stronger, more self-respecting person for having reached and sustained this silence, and that reality remains true and valuable no matter what else unfolds from here. Understanding withdrawal from the other side, in general terms. It's worth offering some general, broadly applicable context about what withdrawal often reflects psychologically, not as a confident claim about any specific person's inner experience, but as useful, general background that can help make sense of patterns that sometimes emerge in relationships characterized by significant differences. In comfort with emotional closeness. People who struggle with sustained intimacy often experience closeness itself as a source of underlying threat, developed through their own earlier life experiences, and this discomfort can produce patterns of withdrawal precisely at the moments when a relationship demands the most vulnerability and consistency. When someone accustomed to a partner absorbing most of a relationship's emotional labor suddenly experiences the absence of that labor, the resulting discomfort can trigger a range of general responses, some involving genuine reflection, some involving further withdrawal, some involving a mix of both that shifts unpredictably over time. This general pattern exists broadly across many relationships and many individuals, and understanding it in these general terms, rather than assuming any single specific reaction is guaranteed, offers useful context without requiring confident, detailed predictions about any one particular person's internal experience. Holding this general understanding loosely, as background context rather than as a confident forecast, can help reduce some of the confusion or self-doubt that might otherwise arise as you navigate this period, without requiring you to become invested in correctly predicting exactly how it will play out in your own specific situation. The real victory available to you. If there's a genuine victory available through this entire process, it's not located in anything that might or might not happen to the other person as a result of your silence. It's located entirely in what you've already accomplished, reaching the clarity necessary to recognize an unsustainable pattern, finding the strength to step back from it, and building, day by day, the capacity to hold that boundary consistently despite discomfort and uncertainty. This victory belongs to you completely, already achieved, regardless of anything else that happens externally from here forward. Reframing victory this way, as something already accomplished rather than something still pending confirmation from someone else's reaction, offers real, immediate peace, available to you right now rather than contingent on some future external event. You don't need to wait for anything further in order to claim this victory. It's already yours, built through everything you've already navigated to reach this specific point in your own healing. Hold this reframed understanding of victory close throughout the rest of this process, returning to it whenever the old pull toward needing external confirmation threatens to pull your attention back toward monitoring or anticipating someone else's response. What comes after the silence fully settles. It's worth looking ahead briefly toward what tends to happen once this silence has fully settled into a stable, sustainable practice, rather than something requiring active, effortful maintenance each day. At this point, silence stops feeling like an active choice you're constantly renewing and starts feeling instead like simply your natural baseline, no longer requiring conscious effort to sustain. Your attention by this point has largely returned to your own life, your own goals, your own relationships, no longer significantly oriented toward monitoring or anticipating anything happening externally. This settling represents the culmination of everything this piece has described throughout, the point where the growth, self-respect, and capacity for stillness you've been building becomes simply part of who you are, rather than something you have to actively maintain against a strong pull toward old patterns. Trust that this settling is coming, even during the moments it still feels distant, understanding that it represents the natural, gradual endpoint of the consistent practice this entire piece has been encouraging throughout. The grief that sometimes accompanies this silence. It would be incomplete to describe this silence purely in terms of strength and growth, without also acknowledging the grief that often accompanies it, especially in its earlier stages. Holding silence often means grieving the version of the relationship you once hoped for, the connection you invested so much in trying to sustain, the future you may have imagined that this silence effectively acknowledges isn't coming, at least not in the form you'd once hoped for. This grief is real and deserves genuine space, rather than being minimized in favor of a purely empowered, strength-focused narrative alone. You are allowed to grieve while also holding this silence firmly, understanding that both experiences can coexist without one canceling out the validity of the other. The silence remains the right choice even as you grieve what led to its necessity, and giving yourself permission to feel this grief fully, rather than rushing past it toward a simpler, more triumphant story, tends to produce more complete, more genuine healing over time. Honor this grief as part of the process, alongside everything else this piece has described, understanding that its presence doesn't undermine the strength and growth also present throughout this same experience. Why you don't need to know what happens next. It's worth closing this section with a direct, clarifying truth. You don't actually need to know what happens next on the other side of this silence in order to feel settled and confident in the choice you've already made. This not knowing, uncomfortable as it might feel, doesn't actually undermine the validity or value of your silence. It simply reflects the genuine uncertainty inherent in any situation where you can't control or predict another person's internal experience or eventual response. Releasing the need to know, allowing yourself to hold this silence without requiring certainty about its eventual outcome, is itself one of the more significant, valuable outcomes available from this entire process. It reflects a level of self-trust and self-sufficiency that doesn't depend on external confirmation in order to feel complete, a genuinely freeing capacity that will serve you well beyond this specific situation. Trust that you don't need to know. You only need to continue holding what you've already, through real difficulty, determined is necessary for your own well-being, regardless of anything else that remains genuinely uncertain. What this piece has really been about. At its core, everything described throughout this piece has really been about a single central idea. Your silence was never actually about producing a specific effect in someone else. It was always about reclaiming your own voice from a pattern where it had been extended indiscriminately, protecting your own energy and peace, and building a genuine, lasting capacity for boundaries and self-respect that will serve you far beyond this specific relationship. This reframing matters more than any specific detail about what might or might not happen externally as a result of this silence. What matters most is the internal shift you've already accomplished, the growth you're already demonstrating, and the peace you're building that doesn't depend on anyone else's response in order to feel genuinely complete. Carry this outcome forward as the true takeaway from everything described throughout this piece. Your silence is valuable, complete, and entirely successful already, regardless of anything else that happens from here forward. The difference between isolation and chosen silence. It's worth drawing a clear distinction between the silence this piece has been describing throughout and isolation more broadly, because the two can sometimes be confused, especially by an empath whose natural instinct toward connection might make any withdrawal from a specific relationship feel, initially, like a broader withdrawal from connectee. On itself, the silence this piece describes is specific and targeted, a boundary held toward one particular relationship or one particular dynamic, not a general retreat from all connection, support, or intimacy in your life more broadly. It's worth actively ensuring throughout this process that you continue investing in other relationships, other sources of connection and support, even while holding silence toward this specific dynamic. This distinction protects you from allowing a healthy, targeted boundary to slide into something closer to general isolation, which would undermine rather than support the genuine healing this piece has been describing throughout. Silence toward one person doesn't mean silence toward everyone, and maintaining active, healthy connection elsewhere is an important part of what makes this specific silence sustainable rather than depleting. Check in with yourself periodically about whether you're maintaining this important distinction, ensuring that your silence remains targeted and specific rather than drifting into a broader pattern of withdrawal from connection and support more generally. What genuine change would actually require to be believed? If change eventually does present itself, whether through renewed contact, a shift in behavior, or some other signal, it's worth having a clear, considered standard ready for what genuine change would actually require in order to be reasonably believed and trusted, rather than being persuaded prematurely by a single compelling gesture. Genuine change tends to be demonstrated through sustained, consistent behavior over a meaningful period of time, not through words alone, not through a single dramatic effort that coincides suspiciously with the discomfort of losing access to something familiar. This standard might include requiring visible evidence of actual internal work, therapy, or genuine self-reflection, rather than simply promises. It might include requiring a track record, sustained over months rather than days or weeks, of handling difficult moments differently than before. Having this standard clearly articulated in advance protects you from being swept along by hope or urgency in a single moment, ensuring that any eventual reconsideration of this dynamic is grounded in solid, demonstrated evidence rather than in wishful interpretation of an isolated gesture. Whether or not this scenario ever actually unfolds, holding this clear standard protects you either way, offering a stable, considered framework for evaluating any future development rather than leaving that evaluation to be constructed reactively, under emotional pressure in the moment itself. A closing reflection on trust in yourself. Everything described throughout this piece ultimately points toward a deeper, more durable trust in yourself, one that doesn't depend on external confirmation or on any specific outcome in order to remain stable. This trust means believing your own assessment of what this relationship required, your own decision to hold this silence, your own capacity to sustain it consistently over time, regardless of anything happening externally. This trust, once built, becomes one of the most valuable, lasting outcomes available from everything you're navigating right now, a permanent resource carried forward into every future situation that similarly tests your own judgment and your own capacity for boundaries. Trust yourself. You have already demonstrated through everything you're doing right now that this trust is genuinely well placed. What other empaths have learned from this same process? It's worth offering some general, broadly shared wisdom drawn from the common experience of empaths who have navigated a similar process of building and sustaining this kind of protective silence, insight drawn from common threads rather than any single specific case. Many report that the anticipation and discomfort leading up to and immediately following the decision to hold silence tends to be more intense than whatever actually follows it, regardless of which direction that following eventually takes. The uncertainty itself, in other words, often proves harder to bear than whatever concrete resolution eventually emerges. Many also report that the specific details of what happens externally, whatever pattern eventually unfolds on the other side of the silence, mattered less to their own long-term healing than they initially expected. What mattered more in retrospect was their own consistency in holding the boundary, their own investment in rebuilding a fuller, more balanced life, their own gradual return to a stable, self-respecting sense of their own worth, independent of anything the other person ultimately did or didn't do in response. This broader, shared pattern offers a kind of general reassurance worth holding onto during this uncertain period. Whatever specific thing happens next, your own healing and your own forward movement remain fully within your control, and they matter more in the long run than whatever specific external event you might currently find yourself anxiously anticipating. The practical shape of days filled with this silence. It's worth translating everything this piece has described into the actual practical shape of your days while holding this silence, because abstract understanding becomes most useful when it informs specific, concrete choices. In practice, this might look like deliberately structuring your days around activities and relationships that have nothing to do with this specific dynamic, ensuring your attention has ample opportunity to genuinely redirect rather than remaining, by default, oriented toward monitoring or anticipating something happening externally. It might look like limiting how often you check for any external signal, whether through shared social spaces, mutual friends, or direct contact, understanding that this kind of monitoring, however understandable, tends to work against the genuine internal shift this silence is meant to support. It might look like proactively reaching out to your own support system, rather than waiting until distress feels acute before asking for help, ensuring you have steady, reliable support consistently available throughout this process rather than only during its more difficult moments. These practical, concrete choices, small and unglamorous as they might seem compared to the larger emotional and psychological themes this piece has described throughout, are actually where a great deal of the real, lasting healing happens, in the accumulated texture of ordinary days handled with genuine intention and care. Closing thoughts on what you're actually building. Beyond the specific relationship and specific silence this piece has been discussing throughout, it's worth naming clearly what you're actually building, in a broader sense, through everything you're navigating during this period. You're building a durable template for how you handle imbalanced emotional labor in future relationships, one that will inform every future situation where the old instinct toward constant, indiscriminate overfunctioning might otherwise try to reassert itself. You're building direct, personal evidence that you're capable of recognizing an unsustainable pattern and protecting yourself from its continuation, evidence that will support your own confidence in every future decision that similarly tests your judgment and your boundaries. This is the real, lasting outcome of everything you're navigating right now, more significant and more durable than whatever specific pattern eventually plays out externally. You are building yourself in real time through everything this difficult period is asking of you, and that building matters more than any single external event ever could. What silence communicates, even without words. It's worth acknowledging honestly that even though this silence isn't primarily about producing a specific effect in someone else, it does inevitably communicate something, simply through its presence, regardless of your intentions. Silence in a relationship accustomed to your constant engagement communicates a genuine shift, whether or not you intend it as a message. This is worth naming directly, not because the communication itself is the point, but because understanding that your silence carries inherent meaning can help you hold it more consciously, more deliberately, rather than experiencing it as simply an absence with no significance at all. This inherent communication doesn't require you to manage or control how it's received. It simply means that your silence, honest and unstrategic as it is, still carries real information, that something has changed, that the previous pattern is no longer sustainable, that your own labor and energy are no longer available in the way they once were. This information exists and gets communicated regardless of your specific intentions, and there's a kind of clarity available in accepting this rather than pretending your silence exists in some kind of communicative vacuum. Accept that your silence communicates something real, while still holding firmly to the understanding that your primary purpose in holding it was never actually about controlling or predicting that communication's effect, but about protecting your own energy and honoring your own boundary regardless of how it's ultimately received. The relief of no longer being the only one trying. One of the more significant, though sometimes overlooked, aspects of this silence is the relief it offers from a specific, exhausting position, being the only person actively trying to sustain a relationship's emotional connection. For a long time, you may have been carrying this weight almost entirely alone, working to maintain closeness, resolve distance, and manage disconnection largely by yourself, regardless of whether that effort was being matched by anything comparable from the other side. Holding silence releases you from this exhausting, one-sided position, at least temporarily, offering real relief from the specific burden of being the sole engine of a relationship's ongoing connection. This relief is worth acknowledging directly, separate from any question of what happens externally as a result. You are no longer carrying this weight alone, whether or not the other person ever steps forward to share it, simply because you've stopped carrying it entirely by yourself in the specific way you had been. This relief is real and significant, worth recognizing fully as one of the more immediate, tangible benefits available from the silence this piece has been describing throughout, independent of anything else that eventually unfolds. A final word on compassion for both sides of this story. It's worth closing this section with a brief reflection on compassion, not only for yourself, which this piece has emphasized throughout, but also in a more limited and appropriate sense for the broader human difficulty this entire situation reflects. Relationships characterized by significant imbalance in emotional labor and comfort with closeness are genuinely difficult for everyone involved, not because either person is simply flawed or malicious, but because both people are navigating real, complicated internal patterns, some more visible and better understood than others. This compassion doesn't require you to excuse behavior that hurt you, to abandon your own boundary, or to take on responsibility for patterns that were never yours to fix. It simply means holding a broader, more humane understanding of the situation, one that doesn't require villainizing anyone in order to fully honor and protect your own needs. This broader compassion, held carefully and without requiring anything of you in return, can make the entire process feel less adversarial and more simply, honestly human, which tends to support more genuine, complete healing than a purely combative framing ever could. What happens to the old fear of being too much? For a long time, part of what may have driven your constant emotional labor was an underlying fear of being too much, too needy, too intense, a fear that kept you working overtime to manage and minimize your own needs in order to remain palatable and easy for someone else to be around. This silence held consistently over time begins to loosen this old fear, simply by demonstrating through direct experience that you can hold a clear boundary, protect your own needs, and remain completely, entirely yourself, without the catastrophe this old fear once predicted. As this fear loosens, you may notice a broader shift in how you approach other relationships as well, a growing willingness to take up appropriate space, to express needs directly rather than minimizing them preemptively, to trust that your authentic self, needs and all, is not actually too much for genuinely healthy relationships to hold. This shift extends far beyond the specific relationship this piece has been discussing throughout, informing a broader, more confident relationship with your own needs and your own worth in every future connection you build. Notice this loosening as it happens, recognizing it as one of the more valuable, transferable outcomes available from everything you're practicing right now, a genuine release from an old fear that likely shaped far more of your life than just this one specific relationship. The long-term view of this entire process. Taking a longer view of everything this piece has described, it's worth considering what this entire process will likely look like in retrospect, once significant time has passed and the acute intensity of this current period has settled into something calmer and more integrated. Looking back, you'll likely recognize this period, difficult as it currently feels, as a genuine turning point, one where you learn to protect your own energy, trust your own judgment, and build a healthier, more sustainable relationship with your own capacity for connection and care. You'll likely recognize, too, that whatever specific pattern eventually played out externally mattered less, in the end, than the internal growth you built through this entire process, growth that continued to serve and inform you long after this specific chapter had resolved and faded into your broader life story. This longer view offers real encouragement during the more difficult, uncertain stretches of this current period, reminding you that the significance of what you're building right now extends well beyond the specific details of this one particular situation. Closing. This piece closes here, having offered everything it can meaningfully offer about the silence you're holding and everything it represents. Whatever happens externally on the other side of this silence, remember that its real value was always located here, in you, in the growth, self-respect, and self-trust you're building through the simple, difficult, genuinely courageous act of finally, consistently choosing yourself. What this silence is not. It's worth closing out this section with a clear, direct statement of what this silence is not, correcting any lingering misunderstanding that might have crept in despite everything this piece has already described. This silence is not cruelty, not manipulation, not a calculated strategy designed to control someone else's emotions or behavior. It is not evidence of coldness or an inability to love deeply. It is not a permanent blanket policy against ever communicating or connecting with anyone again. It is simply, specifically, a boundary held toward one particular dynamic that had become unsustainable, built out of genuine self-respect rather than out of any desire to harm or control. Holding this clear understanding of what your silence actually is and isn't protects you from any lingering guilt or self-doubt that might otherwise arise from mischaracterizing your own healthy boundary as something harsher or more calculated than it actually is. You are not doing anything wrong by holding this silence. You are doing something healthy, necessary, and entirely within your right to do, regardless of how it's perceived or received by anyone else. The version of you on the other side of this silence. Somewhere ahead of you, built out of everything described throughout this piece, is a version of you who has fully integrated this experience, who looks back on this period of silence not with lingering anxiety about what it did or didn't produce externally, but with genuine pride in her own capacity to protect herself, hold her own boundaries, and trust her own judgment even amid real uncertainty and discomfort. This version of you carries forward the wisdom and strength this experience has taught her, without carrying forward the acute difficulty that characterized its earlier stages. This version of you is already forming, built gradually through every day you continue holding this silence with genuine intention and care. Trust her. Trust the process that's building her, and know that she is, even now, closer than she might currently feel, growing steadier and more fully realized with each consistent day of practice you continue to invest in this process. Final words. Your silence is valuable, complete, and already successful, regardless of anything that happens externally from here forward. It reflects real growth, real self-respect, and a genuine, hard-won capacity to protect your own energy and worth. Carry this forward fully and completely into whatever comes next. A word on patience with the timeline. It's worth acknowledging honestly that everything described throughout this piece unfolds according to its own timeline, different for every person, shaped by countless individual factors that have little to do with how thoroughly you understand any of the concepts this piece has offered. Some people find this silence settles into a stable, sustainable practice relatively quickly. Others take considerably longer, moving through periods of doubt, periods of renewed old habit, periods of grief that resurface unexpectedly even well after the initial decision to hold silence has been made. Neither pace reflects anything meaningful about your strength or your ultimate capacity to reach the steady, self-respecting peace this piece has described throughout. Be patient with your own particular timeline, resisting any urge to measure your progress against some imagined standard of how quickly this process is supposed to unfold. What matters is not speed but direction, the gradual, consistent movement toward greater clarity, stillness, and self-trust, even when that movement feels uneven or interrupted by more difficult days along the way. Trust that direction, even during the moments it's hardest to feel, understanding that the destination remains fully available to you regardless of how long the specific journey toward it takes in your own particular case. What remains true no matter what? As this piece nears its conclusion, it's worth restating clearly what remains true regardless of any specific detail about what happens externally, because these truths are the actual foundation this entire piece has been trying to help you build. Your worth remains constant, unaffected by whatever this silence does or doesn't produce in someone else. Your decision to hold this silence was valid, built out of real accumulated experience, not something requiring anyone else's confirmation or validation to be legitimate. Your growth through this process remains fully within your own control, unfolding according to your own continued practice and your own consistent choices, regardless of external circumstances. These truths don't depend on any specific prediction about someone else's behavior or internal experience. They remain solid and reliable regardless of whatever eventually unfolds, offering you a stable foundation to return to whenever uncertainty, doubt, or difficulty make that foundation harder to access in the moment. Hold these truths close, returning to them repeatedly throughout this process, trusting that their stability will continue to support you through whatever comes next, exactly as it has already supported you through everything you've navigated to reach this specific point. The last word. You have found the strength to hold silence, and in doing so, you have already demonstrated exactly the growth, self-respect, and self-trust this entire piece has been describing throughout. Whatever happens next, you carry this strength forward with you permanently, ready to support you through this transition and through everything that follows it, for the rest of a life that remains entirely and completely your own. A reflection on anger and where it fits. It's worth addressing directly a feeling that sometimes accompanies this silence, but that this piece hasn't yet fully named. Anger, specifically anger at having reached the point where this silence became necessary at all. Anger at the accumulated pattern of imbalance that made it so. Anger that might surface alongside the grief and growth this piece has already described. Anger is a legitimate, appropriate response to having extended emotional labor for far longer than was actually sustainable, without adequate reciprocity in return, and it deserves genuine space alongside everything else you're processing right now. Anger held and processed in healthy ways rather than suppressed entirely can actually support the strength and consistency this piece has described throughout, offering clarity and motivation for holding your boundary firmly rather than second-guessing it during moments of doubt. The key is finding constructive outlets for this anger through movement, through honest conversation with trusted people, through writing, rather than letting it either consume you entirely or become suppressed so thoroughly that it resurfaces later in less constructive or less conscious ways. Give yourself full permission to feel this anger, alongside the grief, the growth, and the strength this piece has already described throughout. All of these feelings can coexist, informing and supporting each other rather than needing to be resolved into a single, simpler emotional state before you're allowed to move forward with the healing this piece has outlined. What you can offer yourself right now. As this piece moves toward its true conclusion, it's worth naming directly what you can offer yourself right now, in this present moment, regardless of anything else happening externally. You can offer yourself patience with a process that takes real, genuine time to fully unfold. You can offer yourself compassion for the difficulty of what you're navigating, without needing to minimize or rush past that difficulty in favor of a falsely triumphant narrative alone. You can offer yourself credit for the courage it took to reach and hold this silence in the first place, recognizing that this courage was real and significant, regardless of anything that happens next. You can offer yourself, too, genuine hope for what comes after this specific chapter closes, hope built not on any particular external outcome, but on the broader, well-founded confidence that you are capable of building a genuinely good life, filled with genuine, reciprocal connection, regardless of how this particular situation ultimately resolves. Offer yourself all of this deliberately and repeatedly throughout the days and weeks ahead. You deserve this kindness from yourself, perhaps now more than ever, as you navigate a period that asks real courage and real patience from you, courage and patience you've already demonstrated simply by reaching the clarity and strength this piece has been describing throughout. Final closing words. You have reached the point of holding this silence, and it required real strength, real self-awareness, and real self-respect to get here. Whatever happens next on the other side of this boundary, remember that this strength, awareness, and respect belong to you permanently, ready to carry you forward into whatever comes ahead, regardless of anyone else's specific response. Trust yourself, you have already done the hardest part. The freedom of defining success on your own terms. It's worth addressing directly how you define success during this period, because an unspoken, unexamined definition of success, something like watching someone else visibly struggle or change dramatically in response to your silence, sets you up for continued disappointment regardless of how well you're actually doing in terms of your own healing. In growth, redefining success on your own terms means measuring progress by your own steadiness, your own returning sense of peace, your own rebuilding life, rather than by any specific external outcome involving someone else's reaction to your silence. This redefinition is genuinely freeing because it means success becomes something entirely within your control, achievable regardless of whatever happens externally. You succeed by this redefined standard every time you choose your own well-being over anxious monitoring, every time you invest in your own life rather than waiting for an external signal before allowing yourself to move forward, every time you hold your boundary consistently despite uncertainty or doubt. This is success worth measuring yourself against, far more achievable and far more meaningful than success defined by someone else's unpredictable, uncertain behavior. Adopt this redefined standard deliberately, checking in with yourself periodically about how you're doing according to this more accurate, more achievable measure, rather than continuing to measure your progress against an external outcome that was never actually within your control to determine in the first place. A brief word on celebrating this growth. It's worth naming directly that reaching and sustaining this silence is genuinely worth marking as a milestone, an actual achievement in your own personal growth, deserving of some form of genuine acknowledgement, however small or private that acknowledgement might be. This might mean treating yourself to something meaningful, spending time with people who support and celebrate your own strength, or simply taking a quiet moment to privately honor how far you've already come in reaching this specific point in your own story. Celebrating this milestone doesn't minimize the real difficulty involved in reaching it. It simply recognizes that difficulty and achievement can coexist, that something can be genuinely hard and also genuinely worth honoring as real, meaningful progress. Give yourself this acknowledgement, understanding that you've earned it through everything you've already navigated to arrive at this specific point. Closing. This piece closes here, having offered everything it can meaningfully offer, understanding general patterns worth holding loosely rather than treating as certain, and above all, a consistent redirection back toward the only thing that actually determines your own peace, your own steady, continued commitment to yourself. Whatever happens next, you are equipped for it, carrying forward the strength, clarity, and self-respect this silence has already given you, what this means for the relationships you build next. Everything described throughout this piece will shape, in valuable ways, whoever comes into your life next, whether as a friend, a partner, or any other significant connection. You'll bring a sharper instinct for recognizing early signs of imbalanced emotional labor, rather than waiting, as you may have this time, until exhaustion has fully set in before addressing it. You'll bring a clearer, more considered sense of what genuine reciprocity actually requires, rather than being persuaded prematurely by gestures that haven't yet demonstrated sustained consistency. You'll bring, too, a deeper trust in your own capacity to hold boundaries, even amid discomfort and uncertainty, built through the direct, difficult experience of having lived through exactly what this piece has described. This hard-won wisdom will make every future relationship healthier and more sustainable, not because you'll become guarded or withholding by default, but because you'll bring genuine discernment alongside genuine openness, protecting yourself from repeating a pattern you now understand clearly enough to recognize much earlier than before. Whoever comes next will be meeting a version of you shaped by this experience, not diminished by it, equipped with real wisdom about your own limits and your own worth, ready to build something healthier and more genuinely reciprocal than what came before. The practice of returning to yourself. If there's a single practice worth committing to above all others described throughout this piece, it's the practice of returning again and again to yourself, to your own needs, your own values, your own clarity, whenever anything external threatens to pull your attention away from this central anchor. This practice doesn't require perfection. It simply requires the willingness to notice when your attention has drifted outward, toward speculation or monitoring, and to gently, repeatedly, bring it back home to yourself. This is the real skill underneath everything this piece has described, more valuable than any specific insight about patterns or predictions, because it's the skill that will actually carry you through whatever specific outcome eventually unfolds. Practice it deliberately, patiently, and repeatedly, trusting that each return to yourself, however small, contributes to the larger, more durable steadiness this entire piece has been working to help you build. Truly final words. You have already done the hardest part. Your silence is complete, valuable, and entirely successful, exactly as it stands right now. Whatever comes next, you are equipped and you are ready, carrying forward a strength that belongs permanently and completely to you. What to remember on the hardest days. There will likely be specific days harder than the rest when everything this piece has described feels distant, difficult to access, overshadowed by acute loneliness, doubt, or the old pull toward reflexive engagement. On these hardest days, it's worth having a few simple, clear things to return to, things that don't require extensive reasoning to access even when your capacity for extensive reasoning feels temporarily diminished. Remember that this silence was earned, built out of real accumulated experience, not an overreaction to be second-guessed. Remember that your worth doesn't depend on anyone else's response to it. Remember that healing isn't linear, and a hard day doesn't undo the genuine progress you've already made. Remember, too, that these hardest days do pass, even when they feel, in the moment, as though they might not. This reflects the genuine, well-documented pattern of how healing from significant difficulty actually unfolds, through waves of intensity that do, reliably, soften and become less frequent with continued time and care for yourself. On these hardest days, lean more heavily on your support system, on whatever practices help you feel more grounded, and on simple, basic self-care, understanding that surviving the hardest days is itself a significant, meaningful accomplishment, deserving of real credit even when it doesn't feel like much in the moment. The real gift this experience has given you. Beyond everything specific this piece has described about this particular relationship, the real, lasting gift available from this entire experience is a deeper, more durable relationship with your own judgment, your own limits, and your own worth. You now know from direct experience that you're capable of recognizing an unsustainable pattern and protecting yourself from its continuation, even when doing so is difficult, even when the outcome remains genuinely uncertain. This knowledge becomes a permanent resource, carried forward into every future situation that similarly tests your patience, your boundaries, and your sense of your own worth. This gift, hard-won through real difficulty, is worth recognizing and honoring directly, separate from whatever specific outcome eventually unfolds with this particular relationship. You are, in a real and lasting sense, stronger and wiser for having lived through this experience, equipped now with tools and self-knowledge that will serve you reliably for the rest of your life. Final closing. You have found your silence and you are holding it with real courage and real self-respect. This is enough. Whatever comes next, you are equipped, strengthened, and fully capable of moving forward into a life built entirely on your own terms, whole and completely your own. The value of ritual in marking this shift. It can be genuinely helpful during a significant shift like this one, to mark it with some form of deliberate ritual, however simple, that honors the significance of what you're moving through. This might mean writing a letter you don't send, articulating everything you need to say without the pressure of an actual response. It might mean a small, private ceremony of releasing physical items connected to the relationship, not as an act of erasure, but as a deliberate, symbolic marking of this transition. It might mean simply setting aside dedicated time, away from ordinary distractions, to fully acknowledge and honor what you're moving through. These rituals don't need to be elaborate or follow any particular formula. Their value lies in the deliberate attention and acknowledgement they offer, helping mark this transition as significant, rather than letting it blend anonymously into the ordinary flow of daily life without any specific recognition of its importance. Consider what kind of ritual might feel meaningful and appropriate for you specifically, adapting the general concept to whatever resonates most with your own particular way of processing significant experiences. Whatever form this ritual takes, if you choose to engage in one at all, let it serve the purpose this entire piece has been describing throughout, honoring the difficulty and significance of what you're navigating, while also marking your own intentional, deliberate movement forward into whatever comes next. A reminder about your own resilience. It's worth closing with a direct reminder of something this piece has touched on throughout, but that deserves explicit, final emphasis. You are more resilient than you might currently believe yourself to be, especially during the harder moments of this specific transition. You have already survived difficult things before this relationship, and you will survive this too, carrying forward from it real wisdom, real strength, and a deeper trust in your own capacity to navigate whatever life presents going forward. This resilience isn't something you need to manufacture or prove. It's already present within you, demonstrated through everything you've already survived up to this point, including the difficult work of reaching and holding this silence in the first place. Trust this resilience, especially on the days it feels hardest to access, understanding that its presence doesn't depend on how strong you happen to feel in any particular moment. The final word. You have reached and held this silence, and in doing so, you have already demonstrated exactly the strength and self-respect this entire piece has been describing throughout. Whatever comes next, you carry this strength forward with you, permanently, ready to support you through this transition and through everything that follows it, for the rest of a life that remains entirely and completely your own. A closing metaphor worth holding. It can help during this period to hold a specific image in mind, a lake that has finally been allowed to still after a long period of constant disturbance, its surface settling into clarity and calm simply because nothing continues to disrupt it. For a long time, your own internal state may have resembled water constantly stirred, never given the chance to settle, always in motion because something or someone kept disturbing its surface before it could ever fully calm. This silence is what finally allows the stirring to stop. A still lake doesn't need to do anything in order to become clear. It simply needs the disturbance to cease, and clarity follows naturally, as its own inherent property, requiring no additional effort once the disruption has genuinely ended. Your own clarity, your own peace, is following this same natural process right now, requiring nothing more from you than the continued choice not to reintroduce the disturbance, allowing your own internal state the same chance to settle that this lake requires in order to reveal its own natural stillness. Hold this image whenever the pull to reintroduce old patterns of monitoring or engagement grows strong. You are the lake finally being allowed to settle, and your own natural clarity is already, quietly beginning to emerge, simply because the disturbance has finally, genuinely stopped. The end of this piece, the beginning of what's next. This piece ends here, but your own process continues, unfolding at its own pace, informed by everything described throughout these pages, but ultimately shaped by your own ongoing choices, your own continued practice, your own steady commitment to the silence and the self-respect you've already, painfully but genuinely, earned the right to hold. Whatever comes next on the other side of this specific relationship, remember that your own forward movement, your own healing, and your own worth remain fully within your control, regardless of anything else that happens. Trust yourself, trust the process, and move forward steadily into a life built on your own terms, fully and completely your own. What you'll tell someone else in this position someday. There may come a time further down the road when someone close to you finds themselves navigating a period of silence similar to the one you're moving through right now, and it's worth imagining, briefly, what you might tell them from the vantage point of having already lived through and healed from this exact experience. You'll likely tell them that the anticipation and discomfort of holding silence often feels harder than whatever actually follows it. You'll likely tell them that their own steadiness matters far more than correctly predicting anyone else's reaction. You'll likely tell them that healing takes real time, that setbacks don't undo genuine progress, and that they are far more capable of navigating this than they currently believe themselves to be. Imagining this future conversation can offer a useful, grounding perspective right now, reminding you that the wisdom you'll eventually offer someone else is wisdom you're actively building, right now, through everything you're currently navigating. You are, in a very real sense, becoming the person who will someday offer exactly this kind of steady, hard-won guidance to someone else standing where you're standing today. A brief word on self-care during this process. As you continue moving through everything described throughout this piece, it's worth naming a few concrete forms of self-care that tend to support this kind of healing most effectively, not as a prescriptive checklist, but as gentle suggestions worth considering. Physical movement, even simple daily walks, helps process the nervous system activation that often accompanies this kind of significant emotional work, giving your body a way to metabolize stress that holding silence alone sometimes can't fully address. Journaling, specifically writing out your own reasoning for this silence in your own words, helps reinforce that understanding more deeply than passive reflection alone. Connection with people who see you clearly, who reflect back your worth accurately rather than reinforcing old doubts, remains one of the most valuable resources available during this process. So does simple patience, permission to have difficult days without treating them as evidence of failed healing. understanding that setbacks and difficult moments are a normal part of any genuine transformation rather than signs that something has gone wrong. None of these practices are mandatory, and everyone's healing looks slightly different depending on their own preferences, resources, and circumstances. But it's worth considering, honestly, whether you're offering yourself the kind of care this process actually requires, rather than expecting the silence alone to do all the work without any accompanying practical support for the emotional and physical dimensions of this healing as well. Closing. You have everything you need already: your own clarity, your own strength, and your own capacity to build forward, one steady day at a time, into a life that belongs completely and permanently to you. What genuine repair would actually require? It's worth spending a bit more time on one specific element worth watching for, should any future engagement or reconciliation ever become a genuine consideration. Real repair, not just renewed contact or expressed regret, but an actual acknowledgement of the specific imbalance that led to this silence in the first place, paired with a demonstrated willingness to do things differently going forward. Genuine repair requires more than words. It requires a level of accountability that many people, especially those who struggle with sustained closeness and vulnerability, find genuinely difficult to access, at least without significant, sustained effort over time. If you ever find yourself evaluating whether a specific gesture constitutes genuine repair, it's worth asking directly whether it includes specific acknowledgement of what actually happened, whether it reflects understanding of the actual impact on you rather than a more general, vague apology, and whether it comes paired with any indication of sustained behavioral change rather than simply words effort in a moment of discomfort about losing access to something familiar. Holding this clear standard protects you from being persuaded by anything less than genuine repair, ensuring that any future reconsideration of this relationship, should it ever become relevant, is grounded in real, demonstrated accountability rather than in hope or wishful interpretation of an ambiguous gesture. The wisdom you now carry into every future connection. Everything this piece has described adds up to a specific, valuable body of wisdom that you now carry forward into every future relationship. Wisdom that took real difficulty to earn, but that will serve you reliably for the rest of your life. You understand now, in a way many people never fully grasp, that silence held deliberately and for good reason is not cruelty but self-respect. You understand that your own worth doesn't depend on being constantly available, constantly explaining, constantly filling every gap in communication with your own labor. You understand, too, what genuine reciprocity actually requires, and you now know to hold out for it rather than settling for less simply because settling has become familiar. Carry this wisdom forward with confidence. It is one of the most valuable outcomes of everything you've been through, and it will continue to serve you, quietly and reliably, in every relationship you build from here forward, protecting you from repeating a pattern you now understand clearly enough to recognize and avoid, while remaining fully open to the genuine, reciprocal connection this pattern was always standing between you and receiving. Final words. You reached the point of needing this silence, and you found within yourself the strength to finally hold it. This strength belongs to you now, permanently ready to carry you forward through whatever comes next, regardless of anything that unfolds on the other side. Trust yourself. You are already, in every way that matters, moving forward. The difference between reacting and responding. It's worth drawing a clear, practical distinction between reacting and responding, because this distinction will serve you well not just during this specific period, but in every future situation that tests your patience and your boundaries. Reacting tends to be immediate, driven by whatever emotion is most intense in a given moment, often leading to choices you might not fully endorse once that intensity has settled. Responding, by contrast, involves a brief pause, even just a few moments, before choosing how to act, allowing your more considered values and clarity to guide the choice rather than the immediate emotional intensity of the moment alone. Building this pause into your own behavior, especially during a period when you might be presented with unexpected external developments, protects you from reactive choices you might later regret, giving your own considered clarity the chance to actually inform your behavior rather than being overridden by momentary emotional reactivity. This doesn't mean suppressing your emotions or pretending they don't matter. It means giving yourself enough space to feel them fully while still allowing your more considered judgment to guide your actual choices and actions. Practice this distinction deliberately during the days ahead, building in a small pause whenever significant emotional intensity arises, before deciding how to actually respond to whatever has triggered that intensity. This small practice offers real protection, ensuring that your actions continue to reflect your own considered values rather than being hijacked by momentary emotional reactivity, however understandable that reactivity might be in the moment. A closing blessing for the road ahead. May you move through whatever comes next with steadiness, patience, and genuine self-compassion. May the clarity you've reached continue to deepen and settle, becoming more solid and more automatic with each day that passes. May you find in your own company and in the support of those who genuinely care for you everything you need to navigate this transition fully and completely. And may you arrive in your own time at a place of genuine peace, built not on anyone else's reaction to your silence, but on your own steady, continued commitment to your own worth, your own healing, and your own life, fully and entirely your own. This is where this piece truly ends, offering you not a prediction about anyone else's crumbling, but a foundation, one built entirely out of your own strength, your own clarity, and your own capacity to move forward, regardless of anything else that happens next. What to remember about your own voice going forward. As you move beyond this period of silence, whenever that eventually happens, it's worth carrying forward a clear, considered understanding of how you want to use your voice differently in future relationships, informed by everything this experience has taught you. This means reserving your considerable capacity for explanation, reassurance, and emotional labor for relationships that demonstrate genuine reciprocity from the outset, rather than extending it indiscriminately and hoping reciprocity eventually develops in response. It means noticing early when you find yourself doing a disproportionate share of a relationship's communicative labor, and addressing that imbalance directly rather than simply absorbing it the way you might have before this experience taught you otherwise. It means trusting that a relationship requiring your indiscriminate, near-constant emotional labor in order to function is not a relationship built on a sustainable foundation, regardless of how much genuine care might also be present within it. Carry this understanding forward deliberately, letting it inform every future relationship you build, protecting your voice and your energy for connections genuinely capable of receiving and reciprocating them well. The practical checklist for the days ahead. As a closing, practical summary of everything this piece has described, it may help to have a brief, concrete checklist to return to during moments when the broader concepts feel harder to access. Ground yourself in your own written reasoning for this silence whenever doubt arises. Redirect your attention gently, repeatedly, away from monitoring for someone else's reaction and back toward your own present life. Invest deliberately in your own support system, your own routines, and your own healing process, treating these investments as the real substance of this transition rather than secondary to it. Give yourself permission to feel the full range of emotions this process involves: grief, anger, relief, uncertainty, without judging any of them as wrong or as evidence of failed progress. And trust consistently that your own steady commitment to yourself is the actual determining factor in how this next chapter of your life unfolds, regardless of anything else that happens externally. Return to this checklist whenever you need a concrete, practical anchor, understanding that it distills everything this piece has offered into something immediately actionable, ready to support you through whatever the days and weeks ahead actually bring. Truly final words. You have already done the hardest part. Whatever comes next, you are equipped and you are ready. Recognizing when you're ready to fully release the question. There will likely come a point, somewhere further along in this process than wherever you currently stand, when you notice a genuine readiness to fully release the question of what's happening on the other side of your silence, no longer needing to know, no longer curious about it in any significant way, simply because your own attention has become genuinely, consistently oriented toward your own life instead. This readiness doesn't arrive on command, and it's not something you can force through sheer willpower before it's genuinely available to you, but it does arrive gradually, the same way every other part of this healing process arrives, through consistent practice and the accumulated passage of time. You'll know this readiness has arrived when the question of what's happening externally simply stops occupying significant space in your daily thoughts, when your energy has become genuinely, consistently directed toward your own goals, your own relationships, your own growth. This shift tends to happen gradually enough that you might not notice it in the moment, only recognizing, in retrospect, how much less this question occupies your daily awareness than it once did. When this readiness arrives, let it arrive naturally, without forcing it prematurely or judging yourself for not having reached it sooner. It comes in its own time, built out of everything described throughout this piece, and its eventual arrival is one of the clearest markers of the genuine healing you've been working toward throughout this entire process. What remains when everything else fades? If everything else described throughout this piece eventually fades from active memory, replaced by the ordinary business of a fully lived life, what remains permanently is this. You learned, through real and difficult experience, that you are capable of protecting your own energy, honoring your own worth, and trusting your own judgment, even amid uncertainty. And discomfort, this capacity doesn't fade. It becomes simply part of who you are, informing every future relationship and every future situation that similarly tests your patience and your boundaries. This is the real, lasting legacy of everything you're navigating right now, more significant and more durable than any specific detail about this particular relationship or this particular silence. Carry it forward fully integrated and completely your own, into a future built on the discernment, confidence, and self-knowledge this entire experience has ultimately given you. Closing. You reached your silence, you are holding it with real courage. Whatever happens next, you carry forward everything this experience has already given you. Strength, clarity, wisdom, and a life that remains, now and always, entirely and completely your own. A word on patience with uncertainty. Uncertainty by its nature is uncomfortable, and it's worth acknowledging directly that no amount of reframing or understanding fully removes that discomfort, only makes it more bearable and more manageable while you move through it. You don't need to achieve a state of complete comfort with uncertainty in order to be healing well. You simply need to develop enough tolerance for it that it doesn't prevent you from continuing to invest in your own life and your own forward movement, even while that uncertainty remains genuinely present. This tolerance builds gradually, the same way every other skill described throughout this piece builds, through repeated practice and repeated exposure to the discomfort itself, without that discomfort needing to fully resolve before you're able to function well despite it. Trust that this tolerance is developing. Even during the moments the underlying uncertainty still feels genuinely uncomfortable, understanding that discomfort tolerated is still meaningful progress, even when it hasn't yet been fully resolved into comfort or certainty. What genuine healing actually feels like. It's worth closing with a clear, honest description of what genuine healing from this experience actually tends to feel like, in practice, so you have a realistic sense of what to expect rather than an idealized version that might set you up for unnecessary disappointment. Genuine healing rarely feels dramatic or complete all at once. It feels more often like a gradual lightening, a slow reduction in how much space this specific situation occupies in your daily thoughts, a growing capacity to engage fully with your own life without the old undercurrent of monitoring or anticipation running constantly in the background. It feels eventually like simply living your life, this specific relationship and this specific silence becoming just one part of your broader story rather than its central, defining feature. This is what genuine healing actually looks like, undramatic and gradual, and trusting this realistic picture, rather than an idealized version, helps you recognize genuine progress even when it doesn't feel as dramatic or complete as you might have initially expected. Closing. This piece offers its final word here. You are capable, resilient, and already, through everything you've navigated to reach this point, demonstrating exactly the strength this transition requires. Trust yourself, hold your silence, and move forward steadily and completely into a life that belongs fully and entirely to you. A final reflection on what endures. Relationships change, sometimes suddenly and sometimes gradually, sometimes clearly and sometimes ambiguously, and the specific details of how any particular relationship or dynamic evolves tend to matter less over time than what actually endures afterward. Your own character, your own growth, your own continued capacity for love and connection, undiminished. Whatever difficulty you've just moved through, this is what actually persists, long after the specific details of this particular chapter have faded into the broader, ongoing story of your life. Trust that what endures in you, your capacity for genuine love, your growing wisdom about your own limits and worth, your resilience through real difficulty, matters far more than any specific outcome this piece has speculated about throughout. This enduring core of who you are is what will actually carry you forward, not just through this transition, but through everything life continues to present in the years ahead. The simplest truth. If everything else in this piece feels like too much to hold on to, let this simplest truth remain. You reach the point where silence became necessary and you're honoring it. That's enough. That's genuinely completely enough, and everything else will unfold from there, in its own time, at its own pace, carried forward by the same strength and clarity that got you to this exact moment. Closing. Thank you for trusting this process, and trusting yourself enough to reach and hold this silence in the first place. Whatever comes next, you are ready, equipped, and already in every way that matters, moving forward. The freedom of an unwritten future. It's worth closing with a reflection on the freedom actually available in not knowing exactly what comes next. A freedom easy to overlook when uncertainty feels primarily like a source of anxiety rather than possibility. An unwritten future means nothing has yet been foreclosed, means the specific shape of your life going forward remains genuinely open, shaped by choices you haven't yet made rather than locked into a single predetermined outcome. This openness, while uncomfortable in its uncertainty, also holds real possibility, room for growth and connection and joy that hasn't yet been specifically defined or limited. Rather than experiencing this unwritten quality only as a source of anxious uncertainty, it's worth also holding it, when you can, as a source of genuine possibility, a reminder that the story ahead of you remains yours to write, informed by everything you've learned through this experience but not confined by any single predetermined outcome. This shift in framing doesn't erase the discomfort of uncertainty, but it does offer a more balanced, more hopeful way of holding it alongside whatever difficulty remains present during this transition. Final words, truly. You stand now at the beginning of an unwritten chapter, informed by real difficulty and real growth, equipped with genuine wisdom and genuine strength, ready to write whatever comes next according to your own values and your own worth. This is where this piece leaves you, not with a prediction about anyone else's crumbling, but with an invitation to build forward deliberately and with self-respect into a life that remains entirely and completely yours to shape. A note for the days you feel like giving up on this silence. There will likely be at least one day, maybe several, when everything this piece has described feels genuinely hard to access, when the pull to abandon this silence entirely feels stronger than the resolve to hold it. On these specific days, it's worth having a simple, minimal commitment ready, something smaller than the full weight of everything this piece has described. Simply not reaching out today, simply getting through these next 24 hours, simply postponing any significant decision until tomorrow, when clearer thinking might be more accessible again. This kind of minimal, day-by-day commitment can carry you through the hardest stretches more effectively than trying to hold the entire, larger picture in mind during moments when that larger picture feels genuinely out of reach. Give yourself permission to shrink the time frame when necessary, focusing only on getting through the next day or even the next hour, rather than requiring yourself to maintain full clarity about the entire process at every single moment. This is not a failure of the broader understanding this piece has offered. It's simply a practical, realistic acknowledgement that healing sometimes requires meeting yourself exactly where you are, even when where you are is smaller and more limited than where you'd like to be. The very last word. You are doing this, one day, one choice, one moment of returning to yourself at a time. That is enough, and it will continue to be enough, all the way through to the other side of this transition, into a life built entirely and completely on your own terms. Gratitude for what this taught you, without gratitude for the difficulty. It's worth closing with an honest distinction between two things that sometimes get conflated in discussions of growth through difficulty. Gratitude for the lessons this experience ultimately taught you, and gratitude for the difficulty itself. You don't have to be grateful that this happened, don't have to construct some spiritual narrative where the difficulty was somehow necessary or deserved in order to produce the growth that followed. The difficulty was real, and it was genuinely hard, and none of that needs to be reframed as secretly a gift in order for you to also recognize the genuine value of what you learned as a result of surviving it. You can hold both truths simultaneously. This was hard, and it shouldn't have had to be this hard, and also, having gone through it, you now carry forward real wisdom, real discernment, and real self-understanding that will serve you well beyond this particular chapter. Neither truth cancels out the other, and you don't need to pretend the difficulty was worth it in some cosmic sense in order to still value what you've built out of surviving it. Carry both truths forward honestly, without needing to resolve the tension between them. The difficulty was real, the growth is also real. Both can simply exist side by side as you move forward into whatever comes next, wiser and more grounded than you were before, without needing to be thankful for the difficulty that got you here. Closing. This is where the peace rests now, understood fully, carried gently, no longer a source of doubt but a source of quiet, hard-earned clarity. You reached your silence, you are holding it. And now at last you understand exactly why that was always going to be enough, the simple truth that started this peace. This peace began with a simple distinction, one worth restating clearly now that everything else has been said. An empath's silence is not withdrawal in the punitive sense, and it is not a strategy aimed at producing a particular effect in someone else. It is simply the honest, hard-won stopping of labor that had been extended for far longer than was ever sustainable, held now as a boundary rather than as a weapon. This simple distinction, fully understood, changes everything about how you carry this experience forward, and it's worth returning to again and again, whenever old doubt tries to blur the line between these two separate things. Your silence is valid. It was never about anyone else's reaction. It was always about your own worth, finally, fully protected. Where you go from here? From here, you go forward carrying everything this peace has offered. The understanding of what your silence actually is and isn't, the release from needing external confirmation, the discernment to recognize genuine reciprocity in future relationships, and the confidence to trust your own worth regardless of what any single relationship ultimately reveals about someone else. Its capacity to meet it, this is where the story ends and where your own continues, built now on a foundation of real understanding rather than lingering confusion, ready for whatever comes next in a life that remains fully and completely your own. A closing word of encouragement. Whatever stage of this process you're in right now, whether just beginning to hold this silence for the first time or well along toward the full integration this piece has described, trust that the clarity you're building is real and durable. It doesn't depend on anyone else's confirmation, doesn't require anyone else's growth or eventual understanding, doesn't wait on any external validation to become fully true for you. It's yours already, built out of your own honest reflection, ready to support you through everything that comes next. You are capable of this healing, exactly as capable as anyone who has ever walked this particular path before you. The difficulty of what you experience doesn't disqualify you from reaching the peace this piece has described. If anything, it qualifies you more fully, because you now understand from direct experience exactly what this silence means and why it matters. Carry that understanding forward with confidence, trusting that it will continue to deepen and settle in more fully with each day that passes, until it becomes simply, permanently, how you understand yourself and what you deserve. Final words. Your silence was never about them. It was always about you, reclaiming what was always yours to protect. Carry this understanding forward, complete and unshakable, into a future built on real clarity, real discernment, and a fully restored sense of exactly what you deserve. The last reflection. Somewhere ahead of you is a version of this understanding so fully settled that you'll barely remember what it felt like to doubt it. A version of yourself so grounded in her own worth that questions about what's happening on the other side simply won't arise anymore, replaced entirely by the accurate, complete understanding this piece has worked to build. That version of you is not a distant fantasy. She's already forming, built out of every honest reflection you've engaged in throughout this process, growing steadier with each day that passes. Trust her, trust the process that's building her. And carry forward from this moment onward the simple, complete truth this entire piece has tried to offer. Your silence was never a test of anyone else's reaction. It was and remains an act of returning fully to yourself. Closing line. Carry this forward, complete and finally understood. Your silence is enough, exactly as it is, because it was never about anyone else crumbling. It was about you finally, completely choosing yourself. Final note. May you carry this understanding lightly now, no longer a source of anxious anticipation, but simply a piece of hard-won wisdom, informing how you love and how you allow yourself to be loved, for the rest of a life that belongs completely and permanently to you. The end. This is where the story rests now, understood fully, carried gently, no longer a source of doubt but a source of quiet, hard-earned clarity. You went silent, and in doing so, you finally, completely came back to yourself. You go forward now whole, wiser, and completely your own, ready for whatever comes next, carrying nothing but the truth and everything you deserve still fully ahead of you. A closing thought on what comes after. There is a particular quality to the life that opens up once this silence has done its work, once your energy has fully returned to you and settled into a new, more sustainable rhythm. It's a life where your voice is no longer a constant offering extended indiscriminately, but a considered gift reserved for people and situations that genuinely deserve it. It's a life where stillness no longer feels like a threat to be immediately resolved, but a genuine, comfortable resting place you can return to whenever you need it. It's a life where your own worth no longer requires confirmation from anyone else's reaction in order to feel completely real. This life is available to you now, built out of everything this piece has described, ready to be lived fully and without reservation. Step into it deliberately, trusting that everything you've already done to reach this point has fully prepared you for whatever comes next. Truly, finally, the end. You reached your silence, you held it with courage, and you emerged from it exactly as strong, exactly as whole, and exactly as worthy as you always were, now finally, fully aware of it yourself. A word on legacy. Beyond this specific relationship and this specific silence, it's worth naming what this entire experience contributes to the longer arc of who you're becoming, the kind of person who models, for anyone watching, whether a friend, a sibling, or someone else close to you, that deep feeling and healthy boundaries are not actually in conflict with each other. Every time you demonstrate through your own lived example that silence held with self-respect is not coldness but strength, you offer something valuable to everyone around you, whether or not they ever explicitly recognize what they're learning from watching you navigate this with such care. You don't have to think of this as a mission or a responsibility. It's simply a natural byproduct of living fully inside the transformation this piece has described, a transformation that ripples outward, quietly, into every relationship you touch, showing everyone around you what it actually looks like when someone finally learns to protect her own voice with the same depth and consistency she's always been willing to extend to everyone else. The truest ending available. The truest ending available to this piece was never going to be about what happens to anyone else as a result of your silence. It was always going to be about what happens to you, about the understanding you built, the strength you developed, the peace you reclaimed, all of it earned through real difficulty, but genuinely, permanently yours now, regardless of anything that happens next in anyone else's life. The very truest closing. You are here now, whole and protected, carrying forward everything this experience taught you into a life that finally fully belongs to you. That is enough. It was always going to be enough, and it is yours now for good. One last word. Go now and live it fully, quietly, and completely on your own terms. A final practical note on reintroducing your voice. At some point well after this silence has served its purpose, you may find yourself ready to reintroduce your voice more fully into your life and relationships, no longer withheld out of necessary protection but offered freely, from a place of genuine choice rather than old habit or obligation. This reintroduction, when it happens, tends to feel different from how your voice operated before, more selective, more attuned to whether it's actually being received well, less automatic in its willingness to fill every available silence regardless of reciprocity. Notice this shift when it arrives, understanding it as one of the clearest markers that the deeper work of this entire process has genuinely taken hold. Your voice, once protected through this period of necessary silence, returns changed, wiser, more discerning about where it extends itself, and this change is a genuine gift, one of the most valuable and lasting outcomes available from everything you've navigated throughout this difficult but ultimately transformative process. A reflection on timing one more time. It bears repeating that everything described throughout this piece unfolds on its own timeline, different for every person, and that patience with your own particular pace remains one of the most important practices available to you throughout this entire process. Trust that direction matters more than speed, and that wherever you currently stand, you are exactly where this process requires you to be right now. Absolutely final words. You reached your silence, you are holding it, and you will emerge from it stronger, clearer, and more completely yourself than you were before any of this began. This is enough, and it always was. A note on what you deserve from here forward. Having moved through everything described throughout this piece, it's worth stating plainly and directly what you actually deserve going forward, not as an abstract aspiration, but as a concrete standard worth holding future relationships to. You deserve relationships where your voice is met with an equal voice in return, where silence from you is understood as meaningful rather than simply waited out until you inevitably resume your old role. You deserve reciprocity that doesn't require a breaking point to finally be recognized, connection that doesn't demand you carry the entire weight of its maintenance alone. You deserve simply to be met by people capable of matching the depth of care and presence you're capable of offering. Hold this standard clearly and without apology as you move forward, trusting that everything you've learned through this experience has equipped you to recognize it, pursue it, and receive it fully when it finally arrives. Closing words, genuinely final. Your silence was never about anyone else's crumbling. It was about your own rising, quiet and complete, back into the fullness of who you already were before any of this began. Carry that forward now and always into a life that remains entirely and completely your own. A final word on watching yourself grow. There is something quietly remarkable about watching your own growth unfold in real time throughout a process like this one, noticing, week by week, how much steadier you've become, how much less the old pull toward monitoring or explaining tugs at you, how much more naturally your attention rests in your own present life rather than drifting outward toward you. Uncertainty you can't control. Take time to actually witness this growth as it happens, rather than moving through it so quickly that you miss the chance to fully recognize what you're building. This witnessing matters because it reinforces the growth itself, making it more solid, more integrated, more genuinely yours the more consciously you acknowledge it. You are not simply surviving this process. You are actively becoming someone stronger, wiser, and more fully self-possessed through it, and that becoming deserves your full attention and your genuine pride. The closing word. You went silent, and in that silence, you found your way back to yourself. That is the real story here, more significant than anything that did or didn't happen on the other side of it. Carry it forward whole and complete into everything that comes next. A closing reflection on wholeness. Wholeness, in the context of everything this piece has described, doesn't mean the absence of difficulty or the complete resolution of every lingering question. It means being fully present with yourself, fully in possession of your own voice and your own worth, even while some things remain genuinely uncertain. You are whole not because everything has been neatly resolved, but because you no longer require external resolution in order to feel complete. This is the real wholeness this entire piece has been building toward throughout, and it is, at this point, genuinely and durably yours. Carry this wholeness forward into whatever comes next, trusting that it will hold, because it was built not on anyone else's response, but on the solid, dependable ground of your own reclaimed voice and your own restored sense of worth. Final, complete closing. This is where the piece truly ends. You are whole, you are steady, and your silence, held with such genuine courage, has already given you everything it was ever actually meant to give, yourself fully returned to you. A last reflection on trusting what you cannot see. Much of what this piece has described asks you to trust a process you cannot fully see the end of, to hold silence without certainty about its outcome, to build peace without needing anyone else's confirmation that it's warranted. This kind of trust in the unseen is one of the more demanding forms of faith available to a person, and it's worth acknowledging directly how much genuine courage it requires. You are trusting your own judgment, your own worth, and your own capacity to heal without the reassurance of a guaranteed outcome, and that trust, sustained day after day, is itself one of the most significant accomplishments available from everything this piece has described. Hold this trust gently but firmly, understanding that it doesn't require certainty in order to be well placed. It requires only your own continued willingness to believe in yourself, exactly as you are, exactly as you've already proven yourself to be throughout this entire process. The genuine final word. You are ready, you have always been ready, and whatever comes next, you will meet it exactly as you are, whole, steady, and completely your own. Closing thought. Take this understanding with you into the rest of your life, not as a burden to carry, but as a lantern that lights the way forward, showing you clearly what to protect and what to release, what deserves your voice and what never should have been allowed to cost you so much of it in the first place. You know now. And knowing fully and completely is enough to carry you the rest of the way home. Go now and live it fully and completely your own. You are ready. One final reflection. Whatever this next chapter holds, remember that you arrived here not by accident but by choice, the difficult, deliberate choice to finally protect your own voice and your own peace. That choice was yours alone to make, and you made it. Carry it forward with pride, not as a wound, but as evidence of exactly how capable you are of honoring yourself, fully and without apology, for the rest of your life. The absolute last word. You are whole, you are steady, you are at last entirely your own. That is the truest ending this story could ever have, and it is yours now and always, regardless of anything else that happens next. Go live it fully and without hesitation. The rest of your life is waiting, unshadowed and entirely open, ready for you to walk into it exactly as you are. This is enough. It was always going to be enough, and it is yours. Nothing more needs to be said. The work is done, and it was worth every bit of what it took. You are whole. You are protected. You are at last entirely your own. Go now and live it fully. You are ready now and always.